consultants and infrastructure.
Can someone on the platform please promote the timer to a panelist? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm doing that right now. It should be there in a second.
Daniel, can you see the timer?
Yes.
Are the platform hosts ready to begin?
Yes.
Chairman Mervan, are you ready to begin the hearing? Yes. Please provide a 5-second countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I call to order. Good afternoon. I call this hearing to order. A quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before we proceed, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items for our remote hearing. First, if you are experiencing connectivity issues, please make sure you or your staff contact our designated technical support so these issues can be resolved immediately. Members participating remotely must continue to use the video function for the duration of their participation in the hearing unless they are experiencing connectivity issues or other technical problems that render the member unable to fully participate on camera. It is committee and subcommittee policy that members will remain muted when not recognized. Just like turning your microphone on and off during an in-person hearing, this is out of courtesy to all the members on the committee, and so that background noise does not interfere with another member who is recognized to speak. When you are recognized, you will need to unmute your microphone and pause for a couple of seconds before speaking so that we will be able to hear everything you say. In order to ensure everything members say is captured on the live stream of this hearing, I ask that members pause for 2 to 3 seconds before beginning to speak. If you wish to have a document inserted into the record, please ask for unanimous consent and have your staff email the document to veteranaffairs.hearings@mail.house.gov. It will be uploaded to the committee document repository. Without objection, members will be recognized in order of the subcommittee seniority for questioning witnesses today. This will make it easier for me to ensure all members participating have an opportunity to be recognized. Does any member have a question about the procedures for this hearing? Hearing none, we shall proceed. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon and welcome to our first in-person subcommittee event since the COVID-19 pandemic stopped the world in its tracks. Today we meet to discuss the status of the Department of Veterans Affairs' $16 billion electronic health record modernization program and the recently announced changes to its deployment and governance structures. In March of this year, Secretary McDonough informed Congress that he was pausing the rollout of EHRM and conducting a top-to-bottom strategic review of this program. We received an initial report from the review last week. I must say that while the report proposes some bold changes, it raises more questions than it answers. I was hoping to have the Secretary here today to explain the new path forward for EHRM, but unfortunately he was unable to join us. I am hopeful that Drs. Clancy and Matthews can shed some light on VA's plan in his absence. Dr. Clancy, I want to sincerely thank you for your leadership and as acting Deputy Secretary over the last 7 months. Your passion for VA and our veterans is obvious and commendable. I would also like to congratulate the new Deputy Secretary, Mr. Donald Remy, who was sworn in earlier this week. I look forward to meeting him in the near future and working together to ensure that the EHRM program is a success. Since our last hearing on this program in April, there have been 3 rather concerning reports from VA's Inspector General. One of the IG reports discuss how VA and Cerner failed to provide sufficient training to the employees at Mann Grandstaff VA Medical Center in Spokane. Staff have indicated that the training they received was more focused on pushing buttons rather than any real understanding of how to operate the new system. I expect to hear today how VA intends to improve the training before this program is deployed to any other facility. This report highlights how VA failed the employees of Mann Grandstaff and its associated clinics. I want to applaud and thank the frontline leaders and staff at those facilities. It is because of their heroic efforts in truly unheard of circumstance that no veterans were harmed during this transition. We are grateful for their hard work and dedication. Without them, we would be having a very different conversation today. The 2 other reports highlight VA's failure to conduct a reliable life cycle cost estimate for the program. Specifically, they cite the costs of modernizing VA's physical infrastructure and IT infrastructure. I am aware that many of these costs are not a direct result of VA's modernization effort. They are more a symptom of decades' worth of neglected infrastructure. However, you can't put a modern EHR on an aging IT infrastructure, and you can't update IT infrastructure in an aging VA facility without making improvements. These issues must be addressed, and costs must be accounted for as part of the EHRM project. Secretary McDonough testified before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee last week that VA is working to develop a more reliable cost estimate. I support these efforts. Congress, our veterans, and the American people deserve a full accounting of these costs. To ensure accounting transparency, I plan to introduce the VA Electronic Health Record Transparency Act of 2021 this afternoon. This bill mandates complete accounting and reporting of all expenses related to the EHRM project, including infrastructure costs and consultants. A special thank you to Chairman Takano and Ranking Member Bost, and Representative Anthony Brown, the former chair of the subcommittee, and Representative Susan Lee, the former chair of the subcommittee, for joining me in this important legislation. I thank all the witnesses for appearing today and your work on this incredibly important project, and I look forward to hearing your testimony. I would now like to recognize my colleague, Ranking Member Rosendale, to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My goal for the electronic health record will never change. It'll be the same in this hearing as in any other hearing that this subcommittee may hold. So I'm going to keep my comments rather brief. Until the Cerner system is shown to be absolutely safe in Spokane and fully functional, it must not be rolled out anywhere else. It has to improve operations, not grind them to a halt. It has to improve the delivery of health care, not put our veterans' health at risk. The strategic review is an elaborate explanation of the problems, but the solutions are far and few between. I applaud the decision to pause the program and hope that it stays on paused until we see tangible progress. Otherwise, this report is nothing more than window dressing for business as usual. I'm not interested in shoveling more money into a flawed program just to keep the paychecks flowing. Some may point to other healthcare systems that struggled through electronic health record implementations and did not make such a fuss. I cannot speak to those situations, but low standards and low expectations do not belong in the Department of Veteran Affairs. Not when our veterans' well-being is on the line. Not when billions of taxpayers' dollars are on the line, and the numbers seem to be going up each and every day. Last week, Secretary McDonough assured the Senate that the technology is fundamentally sound. We're going to find out. The proof is in the performance. If the army of crackerjack management consultants and the Tiger teams and the advancement teams and the adoption coaches and the change management experts cannot make headway with the situation in Spokane, then the reason is probably pretty simple. The software just isn't any good, folks. Either that or it isn't good for the VA. We can't let grand intentions get in the way of the facts. I appreciate our witnesses all joining us today, face to face, and I look forward to discussing how we can translate words into real action. Thank you so much, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. I would now like to recognize Chairman Takano for opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Ravan. I want to start off by saying that I truly appreciate the transparency and communication that Secretary McDonough has provided to the committee since his confirmation. It is imperative that we continue to communicate and work together to tackle the challenges that the EHR program and the department overall are facing and deliver results to our nation's veterans. I also want to extend my congratulations to the new Deputy Secretary, Mr. Donald Remy, who was sworn in this week and is taking over management of the EHRM program. This is an incredible undertaking that will require the transparency and communication that Secretary McDonough has promised. Now that the strategic review has been completed, we are at a critical juncture, and it is up to Secretary Remy to right the ship. The completion of this strategic review is a beginning, not an ending, and with the bold choices proposed, I'm confident that VA's new leadership can make a positive impact on the program. Now, in 2018, when the VA made the decision to sign a sole source contract with Cerner in hopes of creating a single record, I had my own misgivings. I will share with the ranking member that I had the thoughts, why are we not sticking with Vista, which we own? It's an open source program, and we own it. But Dr. Rowe and I both, I came to the conclusion that that Vista was inadequate, that it's written in an old programming language for which we don't have a workforce of programmers that can try to fix it. Even though it's the program that VA uses, the various medical centers across the country have evolved it into different forms, and our medical centers can't talk to each other. So we had the problem of veterans leaving California for a vacation on Maine and not able to get their medications because the systems could not talk to each other. So it was not really an option for us to stick with Vista. It was a bipartisan agreement that we move forward with an acquisition. But I did have misgivings about a sole source contract being approved by the then secretary. It was maybe Dr. Shulkin, and then it was continued under Secretary Wilkie. So the sole source contract, the influence on the process by outsiders. There were outsiders involved. And I don't want to turn this into a partisan agreement, a debate about the last administration. But I had other considerations that were burdening me. The previous administration and the sheer cost of it, and we had made many attempts to do this before. One thing that I was in full agreement with Dr. Rowe, then Chairman Rowe, was oversight. Dr. Rowe stood up the Technology and Modernization Subcommittee, and I fully supported it. And I've continued this subcommittee. That's why we're here today. As the Deputy Inspector General, Mr. Case, will testify today, there have been serious issues revealed in the 3 reports released in the past 2 months. The previous lack of transparency in reporting EHRM program cost is particularly discouraging. And I was happy to hear that the Secretary is working to reconcile this in the future. I'm happy to be a co-sponsor of Chairman Revan's legislation to reinforce this reporting and to ensure that VA is providing our committee with accurate and complete cost accounting so that we can make more informed decisions in the future. VA does desperately need this investment in technology and infrastructure, and I'm going to make it a focus of mine to see that this is not a wasted effort. I was also upset to hear that there have been serious training issues at manned grant staff in Spokane. It was disappointing to read in the IJ report that the training provided was a, quote, button-pushing, end quote, lesson rather than substantive training on the Cerner system and the workflow and the new workflow processes. Throughout the pandemic, VA staff across the country have performed heroically to serve veterans. The last thing we should be doing is making the jobs of frontline workers harder. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today, both VA witnesses and Cerner witnesses, on how they are going to fix this issue. It is unacceptable to me that the program of this magnitude that represents such a major investment from Congress, which will serve as a great benefit to veterans, has received such a poor effort in management and execution. So I want to thank Chairman Mervan for holding this hearing on such an important topic, and I look forward to a fresh start for a program under new leadership, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. At this time, I'd like to recognize my colleague, Mr. Bost, Ranking Member of the Veterans Affairs Committee, to deliver any opening remarks he may have. Mr. Bost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we've come here to the end of the VA's strategic review, and I'm encouraged that the Secretary McDonald has not rushed into the process, and I appreciate the VA giving us the report quickly. The VA has finally admitted the extent of the problems. Transparency is critical to build trust. The strategic review recommendations fall into three major areas: reorganization management, improving process, and creating a complete work plan. However, I do not see much in the report about how the technical bugs in the system will be corrected. Now is the time to focus on that in addition to the implementation of the recommendations. The report from Spokane's are still frustrating. It would be irresponsible to deploy Cerner's system into Columbus or any other site until the bugs are worked out. The system has to improve. Unfortunately, that does not seem to have happened yet. At best, VA is planned to make a plan to fix the system. Listen to what I said, planned to make a plan to fix the system. VA and Cerner still have not put forward metrics or benchmarks for what improvement looks like. As I have said before, the Electronic Health Records Modernization Program is too important to get wrong. I hope the strategic review would provide a clear picture of what getting it right looks like. However, when it comes to fixing the technical problems, the picture is still cloudy. Moreover, the Office of Inspector General audits demonstrate how little we actually know about the project's true cost. VA has to produce a new life cycle cost estimate, and it has to be completed and be honest. It is tempting for VA to put blinders on and only focus on next year's budget request. But we can't let that happen because we owe veterans and all taxpayers the truth about the whole cost. I also want to know how the words in the report will translate into real action and improvements. Simply talking about these recommendations is not enough. This is the last and best opportunity to make meaningful changes and get EHRM on the right track. I thank the witnesses for being here. But on a different subject, I'm a little surprised to see the chairman here in person today. Yesterday, he and I talked, and he informed me that next week's full committee markup may or may not, will have an in-person option, despite the fact that members will be in D.C. and voting. The full committee met in person on a hybrid last month, and the EO subcommittee met in person on a hybrid basis yesterday. And the TM subcommittee is meeting in person and on a hybrid here today. The health subcommittee is scheduled to meet in person on a hybrid basis next Tuesday. There's absolutely no reason that the full committee cannot and should not do the same. I've heard zero concerns from any of the committee members on either side since our previous hybrid hearing. Nothing has changed with respect to COVID restrictions in the Capitol or in D.C. since our previous hybrid meeting. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, but virtual hearings have always been a poor replacement for the real thing, and I've expressed that several times. Mr. Chairman, if you're not comfortable meeting in person a week from now, just like we are right now, you are welcome to lead the hearing from Zoom, but I urge you, please, to allow those of us who feel safe now and a week from now to continue to meeting in person to work for the American veterans. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Bost. At this time, we have a number of votes that are pending on the floor. We will recess until those are concluded and then reconvene our hearing afterwards. Thank you to our witnesses for their patience. The subcommittee stands in recess, subject to the call to the chair. I will now introduce the witnesses. Again, thank you for your patience, and we greatly appreciate you being here. I will now introduce the witnesses on our first panel. Dr. Carolyn Clancy is the Assistant Undersecretary for Health for Discovery, Education, and Affiliate Networks with the Veterans Health Administration. Until recently, Dr. Clancy was the Acting Deputy Secretary and oversaw the strategic review of the EHRM program. Dr. Clancy is accompanied by Dr. Cameron Matthews, Assistant Undersecretary for Health for Clinical Services, Veterans Health Administration, and the EHRM Functional Champion. Also with us today, we have Mr. David Case, the Deputy Inspector General from the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of the Inspector General. We will now hear the prepared statements from our panel members. I will remind you to please pause for 2 to 3 seconds before speaking so that the recording will capture all of your words. And please remember to do so when answering members' questions. Thank you. Your written statements in full will be included in the hearing record without objection. Dr. Clancy, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Mervan, Ranking Member Rosendale, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for your steadfast support of our nation's veterans. Before we discuss today's important topic, just as Secretary McDonough did last week before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, I want to highlight a growing crisis, the increase in hospitalizations from COVID-19, specifically from the Delta variant. More than 97% of hospitalized patients with COVID are not vaccinated, and local indoor mask mandates are occurring again primarily because the disease is spreading among those who are not yet vaccinated. This surge of infection is causing us to deploy emergency personnel and resources to multiple areas of the country. Signs that we're seeing mirror prior surges and a warning of what's ahead. Veterans are being exposed to COVID-19 in their communities, which underscores the critical need for everyone to be vaccinated. To those listening, I implore you to get vaccinated to help keep yourself, your loved ones, and our veterans safe. Today, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to update you on VA's efforts to modernize our electronic health record. VA has long been a leader in caring for the whole person, and the authorities and resources you have provided us, the nation's largest integrated health system, are an unprecedented opportunity. We're committed to realizing the full promise of a modern EHR to care for service members and veterans across the care continuum. Veterans' trust in well-being is paramount to us. When we heard concerns from our dedicated employees, the same employees that served with honor and demonstrated their passion for service throughout the pandemic, we listened with the utmost attention. We heard troublesome reports of duplicate prescriptions and poor functionality in the business operations areas that support our engagement with veterans. Also, anyone who has spent time in a clinic or hospital knows that healthcare is a team sport, and we were hearing stories of disrupted communication and coordination within employee teams. Our employees were going to extraordinary lengths to make sure veterans were safe and cared for. This is admirable, and their efforts were largely successful, but I can say from my own background in healthcare quality that new technology should not make it harder to do the right thing. Among multiple challenges, this pivotal transformation of people, processes, and technology was being run in an organizational silo, meaning that some relevant expertise was not included. In fact, an Inspector General report this month found no evidence that our healthcare experts at VHA had a defined role in decision-making or oversight of this healthcare record modernization project. Again, healthcare is a team sport, and there was also a clear lack of testing and training that mirrored a real-life clinical environment. Importantly, the team-based care that VA is known for was not effectively reflected in the training modules, and employees found themselves calling colleagues or running down the hallway to communicate after go-live, once again going out of their way to do the right thing, but going home at night exhausted and worried that the communication barriers might cause them to miss something. The private sector healthcare leaders we've engaged with have told us and the Congress many successful EHR transformation journeys have begun with a tough initial implementation, often several tough implementations. We are a learning healthcare system. We've already learned an immense amount from our colleagues in Spokane from this to inform our way forward. First and foremost, we're establishing unified enterprise-wide governance of this program with direct oversight and supervision by the Deputy Secretary. It is his third day in the office, and I briefed him extensively, as has Dr. Matthews. Key leaders from clinical, technical, acquisition, and finance fields are already collaborating on the way forward, ensuring that everyone who will build this platform, use it, or be affected by it will work in concert to shape it from the beginning. Second, we are shifting from a site-by-site engagement to an enterprise-wide readiness and planning approach. Thus, we will move as a unified organization to deploy the new record strategically based on evidence of which sites are most trained and technologically ready for it. This is technical and physical space infrastructure. And finally, we will create a simulated testing and training environment so teams can properly evaluate and learn the system and how it impacts their work together before it goes live, not after, with the type of team interaction that enables excellence in care and experience for veterans. By making these changes and others that are outlined in my written testimony, we can and we will modernize this critical aspect of our healthcare system, and we are very, very attentive to your concerns about fiscal oversight, and that has to be a very, very important part of this. But we're building a system that helps providers understand each veteran's unique story and wrap around them the resources of our nationally integrated system. That's the end goal. We can get there, and we will. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Clancy. Mr. Case, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Mervin, Ranking Member Rosendale, and subcommittee members, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Office of Inspector General's oversight of VA's electronic health record modernization program. First, we want to applaud the VA employees working hard at the Man-Grandstaff VA Medical Center and across VA to ensure veterans receive timely, high-quality health care during the EHR transition, particularly during the pandemic. Since April 2020, we have issued 5 reports primarily focused on planning, system training, and other deployment activities at Man-Grandstaff. They are meant to help VA's leaders improve future deployments. While VA has implemented some of our recommendations from 2020, there is much work remaining. We, like other stakeholders, look forward to further information on the strategic review's results as VA seeks to improve the program. VA needs to spend billions of dollars on physical and IT-related infrastructure upgrades. To develop a better picture of the costs and risks, the OIG conducted 2 audits of cost estimates for the infrastructure upgrades. These audits followed our April 2020 report that found VA did not meet its own deadline for infrastructure upgrades at Man-Grandstaff. We found the cost estimates were unreliable. They were not comprehensive, not well documented, inaccurate, and not credible. We also found the VA did not report accurate and complete information to Congress in 9 congressional reports to date. EHRM did not report the estimated $2.7 billion for physical infrastructure upgrades and the estimated $2.5 billion for IT infrastructure upgrades because they believed the upgrades were outside their responsibility, despite VA and GAO guidance requiring life cycle cost estimates to include all costs, regardless of funding source. Omissions can significantly understate a program's true cost. That said, we did observe some improvements in IT infrastructure cost estimates. Last week, we published a healthcare inspection of the development and delivery of training content to users of the new EHR and the assessment of post-training staff proficiency. We found decision-making did not appropriately engage the VHA staff who will use the system. VA's training program was structured to benefit from the lessons learned after DoD encountered problems with staff training during its initial deployment of the Cerner system. Nevertheless, we found VA suffered many of the same problems. Training on these new workflows educates the staff on how they fit into the overall delivery of care, but we found that training content was inadequate. We also found the training delivery to be problematic, with issues concerning the time for training, the training domain, the assignment of user roles, and training support. Finally, VA failed to effectively evaluate its training. When we asked OEHRM to provide training evaluation data, VA initially told us, quote, 89% of proficiency checks were passed with a score of 80% or higher in 3 attempts or less, end quote. However, we found an earlier version drafted by VA OEHRM staff showing only, quote, 44% of proficiency checks were passed with a score of 80% or higher in 3 attempts or less. The OIG concluded that data was removed and altered prior to submission. We are reviewing the issue more thoroughly after informing VA leaders. 2 themes emerge from these reports. First, a need for a governance structure that meaningfully engages all components of VA in the modernization program on a sustained basis. Second, there is a need for better transparency, including between VA components. The OIG will continue oversight on several fronts. We are working with the DoD OIG to review the extent to which the new system will achieve interoperability among departments and community health providers. We are starting a review of the national deployment schedule, and we are reviewing patient care issues and pharmacy operations at man-grant staff. Chairman Mervin, this concludes my statement. I would be happy to answer any questions you or other subcommittee members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Case. We will now begin the questioning for panel 1. As a reminder to my colleagues that members should pause 2 to 3 seconds before speaking so that all your questions are captured. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Dr. Clancy, in his testimony before the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, Secretary McDonough signaled a shift from the geographical schedule to an enterprise readiness process. Can you provide more detail on what that means?
I'm delighted to do so, sir. And we are still building this and look forward to actually keeping you informed at every step of the way as we move forward. As you know, we had a site-by-site approach, which meant that some sites in our system would look at where they were in the calendar and say, phew, I don't have to think about this for 6, 8 or more years, so I'm not paying any attention. The only way that we get full return on investment and the maximal value for the veterans we serve is if we are standardizing workflows across the system. So if Dr. Matthews is calling me up to say, you need to get with the new program, and I'm thinking it's 8 years away, it's a little harder to get my attention. So we think that it's going to be very, very important to take an enterprise-wide approach to getting these workflows right. I think you or Chairman Takano had referenced earlier how differently our systems are configured, or of the same VISTA program. When a young doc who worked for me in New Vista Cold went to the DCVA to help out during the pandemic, I was shocked that he had such a steep learning curve. And I think this goes on all the time, and much less how it impacts veterans. So that is part of it. We will not be scheduling any deployments in the next 6 months. The Secretary is optimistic that at the end of calendar year, this calendar year 2021, he will be able to discern a new deployment schedule. But what we were going to be doing is state reviews at all for IT and physical infrastructure requirements at every facility in our system. And then we will subsequently deploy based on which sites are in the greatest state of readiness.
Just as a follow-up before that, a state of readiness. So infrastructure investment is something that the OIG had mentioned.
Yes.
Is there a study, a survey, a pathway that identifies what locations are that have that proper infrastructure in order to support the transition to the EHRM and to Cerner?
Well, this is why we're going to be conducting on-site reviews so that we will know from the get-go what we need. Initially, VHA focused a lot of attention on Vision 20 because Several years ago, our thought was that we would start in the Pacific Northwest because that's where the Department of Defense started and so forth. We're now taking a much broader view, and we're effectively decoupling or delinking, if you will, getting the physical and technical infrastructure set from the actual go live, turn on the switch, now you're in the new system. As you know, many of our facilities most of them are not new. Some of them are quite old. So this will be a way for us to achieve a state of readiness in all facilities and, frankly, to give you the cost estimates that you've made a big point of, and we should have been far more transparent about that.
So I realize that answer, but I'm going to follow up with another question. How will those sites be selected? What milestones must be met, and how many sites do you plan to take live per year?
That is what we're still working through, and again, we'll be keeping you updated along the way. What I can say is the approach that we are working through right now is pretty similar to what the Department of Defense did after they had some initial tough implementations. And what they're finding now is that they can do multiple deployments, 5, 7, or more facilities, almost in the same time frame, because they've taken a very different approach.
How confident are you that the VA will still be able to finish deploying the system by 2028, and when will you have an updated deployment timeline?
I would expect that would be in the coming months, but again, as we refine our estimates, we'll be keeping you and your colleagues informed at every step of the way. And I think Mr. Case's comment about shared governance and transparency across VA components has to and will be a very important part of this.
I thank you very much.
Thank you.
At this time, I would like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Rosendale. You're recognized for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate that. Mr. Case, based on your, let me see here. I'm going to go to the report. In the report on training, you found that the Office of Electronic Health Record Modernization officials withheld and altered data. The effect was to make the training appear more successful than it truly had been. Have you identified who was responsible for this misrepresentation?
Congressman, as soon as we discovered the problem, we thought it was important to get the report out, and we notified VA leaders. But what we've done, our Office of Special Reviews, which is very skilled at these kind of investigations, is currently investigating exactly who did it, what happened, and what motive there was, if any, into that.
And what action do you plan to take once you make those determinations?
We'll publish a report, as we always do. The decision on what consequences will happen is within the VA's Secretary's purview, and he will have access to the information that we've developed in terms of our investigation.
I would certainly hope that the administration would take a very hard stance when it does this evaluation, because first of all, it breeds an atmosphere of corruption, quite frankly, to mislead you, to mislead this body, so that it keeps us from doing our work, and it will continue to get worse if a halt isn't brought to it immediately. Can you understand why that discovery undermines the credibility of this strategic report?
Congressman, that's why we called it out immediately in our report. That's why we're opening up and have opened up a special investigation into this. And we will report our findings on the facts and other things we find as soon as we have them available and we're confident in them.
Mr. Case, after the last few audit reports, I'm sorry, but I don't have a lot of confidence in VA's ability to produce a credible life cycle cost estimate. We continue to hear different factors coming in that had been overlooked previously. What improvements do you need to see in the next estimate to consider it credible?
There's a number of improvements that need to be made, better documentation of how they derived it. It should leave an audit trail, the documentation, so other people can reconstruct how the estimate was done. There needs to be sensitivity analysis, how variations will affect the ultimate estimate. But most critical from our view is that there needs to be an independent cost assessment. That's a requirement of VA policy. It's a recommended best practice by GAO. And that independent cost estimate will help validate the cost estimates VA prepares and will hopefully uncover any blind spots, unwarranted assumptions in those cost estimates. Those are the basic things that have to be done.
So based on the information that you provided and the circumstances, if you will, with which it has been provided, the VA requested $2.7 billion for the EHRM for next year. Based on those audits, based on the atmosphere with which they were produced under, do you think Congress should grant these requests as is?
All we can comment on is the results of our work. We can say that we had issues with the cost estimates on the IT infrastructure estimates, which were part of that budget request. But to point out, that budget request of roughly $2.7 billion does not include physical infrastructure costs. Those are part of the NRM, non-recurring maintenance request, and we understand roughly $1.2 billion of the $2.3 billion non-recurring maintenance request is also for upgrades on physical infrastructure. So we can't comment really other than the work we've done, which is to focus on the reliability of the cost estimates.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm about down, so I would yield back.
So, Mr. Congressman, if I might, Mr. Rosendale, I just wanted to emphasize that we will be conducting an independently done life cycle cost estimate, and again, we'll be sharing that with you and other members of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. At this time, I'd like to recognize Chairman Takano for questioning.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to welcome Dr. Clancy. It's good to see you in person before the committee. And I just want to, for the record, say that you're one of the people who've transcended administrations. I've known you for probably 9 years now through Republican and Democratic administrations. I appreciate the service you've given to our country and the Veterans Administration. While I'd like to, I do want to say that while I would have liked to have seen a witness today from OEHRM, the committee has been assured that our witnesses today can answer all the questions in their absence. The OIG has reported that OEHRM change management contracting officials scored Cerner's performance, quote, largely at the satisfactory level and the minimum rating to meet contractual requirements, end quote. This is despite numerous accounts from users of the system that training was not sufficient. I may be mistaken, but it sounds a lot like VA may be giving Cerner a passing grade just in order to keep the contract going. But my first question is to Mr. Case. How would you rate OHRM's ability to monitor contractor performance on training?
To date, we didn't think they had done a thorough job of doing that, and part of the result of that is that the training was not sufficient. That can improve going forward, and it sounds like there's going to be governance put in place to improve that according to the lessons learned from the strategic review. But the proof is in the result, and the training was not sufficient for the man-grant staff.
So it's been inadequate up to this point, but you believe it can improve. Have you made any recommendations to VA about improving contracting oversight at OHRM, given the issues you found in your reporting on training?
We do believe that they need to be more focused on the preparation that Cerner will do of the training plan, in the review of the training plan, And in evaluating the training plan, once it's implemented, all those need to be done to, really the goal is to get to training that's effective. That's where it has to be, and that's the result I think we all want to get to. And
Have you had any discussions with the Chief Acquisition Officer during the course of this investigation?
we have not.
What recommendations would you make to VA to better use the resources and expertise of his office to contribute to the oversight of the Cerner contract?
Once again, our recommendations go basically to a governance system that encompasses all aspects of VA and its various components and its expertise. And it should include that as well as VHA, as well as OINT, finance, legal, all parts of VA to really, this is a big effort. And if our reports have shown anything, it's a complicated effort, and you have to engage all parts of VA in the effort.
Thank you, Mr. Case. Dr. Clancy, what is your opinion after completing the strategic review that OHRM can handle contracting responsibilities going forward?
I would say, based on the Inspector General's report and our own findings from visits on the ground with our colleagues, multiple site visits, and we've actually had patient safety teams out there helping them a lot. In fact, I was speaking to the director this morning. I would say they're making progress, but the training plan, I believe, was not up to the task.
Have there been any internal discussions about a change in management structure as a result of the strategic review?
Absolutely, and we look forward to briefing you all about that in the very near future, understanding that this is Mr. Remy's third day in the office. As I mentioned, I had briefed him pretty extensively this morning, and I've been making mental notes all day in my brain about additional features to bring up, including this hearing. But yes, that is very high on our brains, and it really touches on many of the points that Mr. Case just made in terms of transparency across VHA components. I also want to say that a very strong voice from the Veterans Health Administration, as represented here by Dr. Matthews, is going to be a very important part of this moving forward.
Well, that's important to know. Mr. Chairman, I'll be making some brief comments on the floor. I'll be returning for what I will believe will be more rounds of questioning. Thank you for your testimony, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. At this time, I'd like to recognize fellow Hoosier Congressman Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Clancy, I want to talk about a long-standing frustration, the EHRM life cycle cost estimate. I sent a letter summarizing how it has been suspicious and downright implausible since virtually the day that it was written 3 years ago. And I'm glad the Secretary is committed to revamping it. First of all, are you going to throw the whole thing out and start from scratch?
We are starting from scratch, yes.
Okay. The OIG did us a great service with their 2 audits of the infrastructure costs that were excluded from the estimate that the VA reported to Congress. First of all, the VA estimated that the physical infrastructure cost at $2.7 billion and $1.1 billion at different times. But OIG estimated them at between $3 billion and $3.7 billion. Have you been able to determine a reliable estimate at this point?
Well, this is why we think an independent estimate is going to be very, very important. Part of the ambiguity here is that because our facilities are very old, often the same physical infrastructure upgrades that are needed for installing a new record are also needed for other reasons. So whether you put it in the non-recurring maintenance bucket or the EHRM bucket is can be a point of, decision. What we owe you is absolute transparency and clear fiscal oversight, for sure.
Safe to say we're still working on it.
Yes.
Okay.
But
Let's move on to the
we hear
second.
you loud and clear. I want to make that
Got it.
point.
Let's move on to the second OIG audit. The VA excluded $2.5 billion of IT infrastructure costs from the life cycle cost estimate. There does not seem to be any debate about that. But can you assure me that that's the extent of the IT infrastructure costs, and are there not any others that remain unaccounted for?
I have a lot of confidence in the IG reports, but again, an independent group will be taking a hard look at this, and if it's different than that, you will be the first to know.
Okay, so there could be other IT infrastructure costs.
Yes.
Okay. The true life cycle cost estimate may be as high as $21 billion based on these two OIG audits alone. The former VA Chief Information Officer, Roger Baker, said that it's realistically around $30 billion. When will you be able to present a true life cycle cost estimate, and how much more money do you think is reasonable to ask taxpayers to accomplish for this project?
Well, I want to be clear that the Secretary's aspiration is that we come in on time, if not sooner, and within the budget that you have allocated. We believe a full independent life cycle cost estimate will take close to a year, but we will be updating you as we get more information along that path, for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. At this time, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Matthews, thank you for joining us. A communication went out today that specifically talked about to all end users that an all-encompassing checklist for readiness would be prepared. Can you define that for us and give us the meaning of what that purpose of that email is?
Definitely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Dr. Clancy was referencing to the Chairman's question regarding a readiness deployment calendar moving forward, what we want to assure is that the concept of readiness goes beyond just the technical components, whether or not the actual physical infrastructure or technical infrastructure is in place, but indeed that broader readiness is taken into account. This is a transformation more than just the change of an EHR. As Dr. Clancy mentioned, we also need to be looking at enterprise workflows. So is the facility ready to deploy new business operations? It's a business transformation. Do they have the staffing ready? Do they have the change management fundamentals in place as far as leadership down? Has the training been completed? Of course, that would be on the checklist. Have they been trained even beyond the system, but to the data reports that are coming out of the system, how to use those reports? Readiness in our mind that we recognize was one of the shortcomings in preparation of Spokane to go live was that the larger business operations concept of readiness, how the facility would use Cerner as opposed to how just the end users would use Cerner, that's the necessary comprehensiveness that we really want to take into account. So we will have checklists, not just individual end users doing their trainings, facilities, whether they're staffed, but then also at the VISN level, the VISN safety staff, for instance, working with the facility so that they could look at the tickets that are submitted. We're seeing broader concepts of readiness way beyond just the technology, and that's the comprehensive checklist we refer to.
May I ask, can we get a copy of that checklist?
Of course, it is in early draft form. It's not being circulated yet. You will get a copy. Full transparency, definitely. We are looking to also share this and get input. We don't expect to have a matured checklist even with, I would honestly say, the next couple of deployments. The idea is that the readiness actually becomes more mature. We learn more with each deployment. The entire concept of an EHR deployment is that it's iterative. So we learned a great deal from Spokane. We improved there. With the next deployment, we'll add more items to the readiness checklist. So over time, it will actually grow. It will probably get a bit overwhelming, to be honest. But in that sense, the very last couple of sites and deployment calendar, whenever they are going, would have the absolute comprehensive approach and the lessons learned from every facility prior.
So you had mentioned time commitments for training. One of my questions is, given the time commitments from staff needed to demonstrate competency on the new system, is there an awareness of potential impact to patient care during a facility's migration of the new system?
My goodness, yes. My goodness, yes. This is a huge productivity issue that really could, actually with any EHR deployment, affects access. And what we want to do is further optimize training so that it's not just as a physician you're ending up taking with some deployments, not necessarily with ours, but with some deployments you can hear 16 hours worth of training for a given physician. I mean, that's just overwhelming when you're talking about the number of courses that you have to take. We want to fine tune, we want to build in a lot more adult learning capacity so that there can be competency checked throughout the actual training process, that it's more hands-on, that it's more team-based as well too, so there can be learning as you actually might practice. So the idea is to really optimize the amount of training and not lengthen in any sort of way, and to actually fine-tune it to the actual user. A primary care doc such as myself shouldn't necessarily get the same training as perhaps the surgeon or the nurse or the administrator checking in the veteran at the front desk, that the training needs to be distinguished.
Okay, thank you. At this time, I'd like to, I'm completed, recognize Congressman Rosendale for his questioning.
Just for clarification, not a doctor. Thank you. Dr. Clancy, I really don't wish to be confrontational or demeaning. However, logic, I'm sorry, keeps me from understanding how you will be able to train and operate numerous facilities simultaneously when it has not been demonstrated that you can even bring one Category 3 facility up to speed. We're not there yet. And so I understand trying to get everybody on the same sheet of music, if you will, and doing it at one time and trying to use those efficiencies. But if we can't bring a Category 3 up to speed by itself, you're going to have a tough time convincing me of the logic to be spreading this problem to many facilities. Altogether, how many patient safety incident reports have there been at Main Grandstaff since Cerner go live last October?
So, Congressman, I just want to assure you that we are very, very concerned and working very closely with the teams in Spokane, including the director, and we think we're making progress. I want to take that for the record because I have heard several different numbers because of some duplicate reports, but we will get that information to you very shortly.
I would appreciate that. That is a critically important component to me.
And if I could make one other point, Congressman, to the best of our knowledge, there has not been patient harms, right? What people are reporting are situations that they are worried may impact patient safety, and I bet they're right. In terms of communication failures, for example, I want to send a patient to a cardiologist or to a surgeon, and I hit the button, and I'm not sure that the other end is getting the message.
I
all
understand,
that
and we're
kind
going
of
to drill
stuff.
into
Yeah,
that, Dr.
yeah.
Clancy. I'm glad that you made that distinction. Have you and Cerner agreed on a definition what constitutes a patient safety issue?
We have worked closely since before the deployment on something called the Joint Patient Safety Reporting System. This is a system that was developed jointly with the Department of Defense. At that point, completely unaware that we would be on the same transformation journey together. And it includes what are sometimes referred to as near misses, as risky occurrences or risky events.
Again, so have
predispose.
you and Cerner agreed on a strict definition of a patient safety issue?
We are defining that first at a business level, and will then be communicating that effectively to Cerner, yes.
Okay, so is the Man Grandstaff Medical Center safe for our veterans?
It is safe for our veterans today because of extraordinary staff efforts. The end game here is that it is safe and that it's easy for the people providing care there to be constantly checking with this joint patient safety reporting system, because this is something that has to go on all the time, no matter new record, old record, whatever, and that it's easy for them to do. We have not gotten to that level of ease and confidence yet.
Okay, so what I also have heard is something that is significant harm, okay, to the patients. And to me, if there's been harm to a patient, again, do we have a strict definition of what significant harm is to a patient?
Death from a medical care would be a significant harm. Permanent injury would be a significant harm. Even lesser degrees of injury I would call a significant harm for sure.
And do you believe that any harm that is caused by the facility is acceptable?
No. Do I think we will ever get to a place where there is no harm? No. That is the goal at all times. But healthcare can be risky business. So that's why electronic health records have to make communication between team members very easy. It's why team training is going to be very, very important and so forth.
Okay, and so when can I expect to get those reports on the incidents?
Within the next week.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. At this time, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Reading through the IG report on training, change management appears to have been somewhat lacking. In fact, the Director of Change Management described VA's plan for evaluating the Cerner training as in its infancy, quote unquote. And the IG noted that EHRM didn't even follow it. 5 months after go live, the VA EHRM Director of Change Management told the OIG, quote, in terms of having an actual, well thought out designed plan at this point, no, we don't, end quote. Dr. Clancy, until a few days ago, you were the acting deputy secretary, the responsible official for the entire EHRM program. In your opinion, did EHRM have an adequate training evaluation plan?
I would say from the comments that you just read in the Inspector General's report, no.
Okay. Mr. Case, can you comment on that, please?
We reached that conclusion, Congressman, that the training evaluation plan and its implementation was inadequate. It just wasn't an adequate plan there, and what was there wasn't adequately implemented.
And if I could just make one point, sir, I will say that in recent months, staff from OEHRM, from VHA, and Cerner have been working together with the colleagues, teams on the ground at Spokane, but we are still working through what a clear evaluation plan would be going forward. And a lot of this gets to redesigning training and thinking about how do we have a simulated environment where teams can practice as teams, but not with patients there prior to go live.
Okay. The strategic review noted the need for extended training for frontline employees. It also indicated that staff felt like they weren't being trained on how their jobs were changing. When I think of a testing or sandbox environment, I think of an exact replica of the production system with fake data. Is this what VA and Cerner is using?
Well, we are still in the very early developmental stages, but yes, it is a fake or simulated environment.
Does the new training and the new standardized workflows so that staff understand how their jobs are changing and how to document in the new system?
Yes, that will be part of it as well as a careful review of how user roles are assigned in this record, because that's a very key part of it as well.
So something that the IG had mentioned was the buttonology technique and that term. It appeared to me that the end user didn't understand how it linked itself into many other systems. And you had referenced teamwork.
Yes.
What are we going to do other than all the sandbox in those terms in order to make sure that those teams are working in unification to make sure that the end user and that they are educated with those end uses so that they're not being trained just on hitting and location of those buttons?
Yes, so if I could use a pretty simple language example, you know, every day in VA, people are provided great care by terrific teams, and a lot of the work they do is autopilot. I do X, I pass off to Dr. Matthews, we then get a nurse involved or whatever, and a lot of this involves daily huddles and making sure that we don't miss anything, you know, checking in with each other all the time to make sure that every patient has everything that they need and so forth. But it's on autopilot, right? I think what we heard from folks at Mann Grandstaff was that they could not figure out in this new system where their prior responsibilities were, what their teammates were doing and so forth. So that's why we think this team training prior to go live is hugely important, because first you've got to be very conscious and articulate how we were doing work and then what it's going to look like in this new system. I think it's possible. Many systems have done it. We've been encouraged by many private systems that experience many of the same problems that we had in Spokane, but we will not rest until this is done.
May I follow up, Dr. Clancy? If you can just give me a definition of what fake environment means.
Sure, and we'll be happy to do that. The best example I ever saw in real life was at a medical school where I was visiting, and they had a simulation lab for all kinds of things. There are many procedures that, I'm sorry to say, when I was training, we learned on patients. In fact, some patients would acknowledge that and say, I get it, that's how people learn. Now, students routinely learn many of these techniques and procedures in a laboratory with mannequins and so forth. And the state of these simulation labs has advanced quite dramatically, and I've visited many of them. Linking it to the EHR training and upgrading of workflows was something I saw a number of years ago and was quite intrigued by how they did this. So they would get the software people and the engineers to redesign, for example, how diabetes care is provided, and then they would bring in the teams of people who provide diabetes care and say, break it, tell us what's wrong here, and so forth. And that's what team training is about.
I thank you very much. At this time, I recognize Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Clancy, when you're getting that other information for me, if you could also get the number of incident reports that were in July, August, and September of 2020, please. Was the man grant staff ready for Cerner to be implemented, Dr. Clancy?
With the clarity that comes with hindsight, possibly not. First of all, I think we all need to acknowledge that this implementation during a pandemic is almost unprecedented. I know that Cerner did one with a very small rural hospital, or I've read about this, where all the training was virtual and so forth, and from reports I've read that sounded successful. But when man grant staff went live, we were on the edge of a big upswing in COVID infections, including that impacted some of the trainers themselves. We went into this deployment with a lot of confidence in what is sometimes called at-the-elbow support. You can't do that in an environment where you're social distancing. You know, at the elbow does not mean 6 feet away, and so on and so forth. So a lot of that was extremely unfortunate, and clearly not any attention paid to the value of teamwork, and I think a lot of confusion about user roles and responsibilities in this new system.
Okay. Long and short, though, wasn't ready.
Yes.
Thank you. The report says the VA will, quote, consider development of criteria to delay implementation if readiness is not present. Are you telling me that there was no criteria available or created to evaluate whether man grant staff was ready for the Cerner system?
We certainly didn't have anything remotely like the checklist that Dr. Matthews just described. We had pieces of it, but it certainly was not integrated in the way that she described to you, nor did we have a clear sense of how this would be an iterative process. Okay. I will say that our colleagues in EHRM did say, when you put in a new system like this, you are effectively creating a system of continuous learning, right? Because as we learn, first of all, the technology will advance, which is a good thing. Secondly, people will be able to see more and more capabilities that they didn't recognize initially, and so forth.
But the original checklist needs to be available, and so now we are going to have that.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it a fact that Dr. Fisher, the medical center director, delayed the go-live in February 2020 because they were not ready?
I'm going to have to take that for the record. I have read reports to the effect that there was an initial deployment planned for that time period. How much of that was the facility holding back? I know that there were specific issues that were clearly thought to be not ready for deployment, and how much of that was the pandemic and lockdown starting at that point in time.
So I would like, when you, for the record, if you could provide for me who made those recommendations and why they made those recommendations, so we can see why the delay was requested and who it was made by.
Yes.
That would be great.
Yes.
When the Cerner go live happened in October 2020, did Dr. Fisher, this is part of that same request, believe that the medical center was ready, or was the go live just pushed through anyway? So this is going to go back to that request. Who asked for the delay, and why did they ask for the delay?
We will get you that information to the best of our ability. I do want to emphasize that a big part of our new governance approach moving forward, and again, Mr. Case, I think, said this very clearly, in terms of transparency across components that are engaged with this transformation, is going to be vital.
So regardless of whether
Yeah.
the problem was from pandemic or whether it was because of lack of training or equipment, whatever, can we agree that the Grand Grandstaff facility was not ready to go live?
It probably was not ready to go live. And again, but that's looking back.
Sure, sure. Okay, I've got just a couple more questions about the, a couple of things, but I'm down to 12 seconds, Mr. Chair. So. Okay, what I would like to, if I could get some information about the report proposes exit criteria for Spokane. First of all, what does it mean to exit?
To exit would be to tell our colleagues from patient safety, who've been working very, very closely with teams on the ground in Spokane, that they can go back to their other jobs. I mean, they have been deployed to Spokane for 4 to 6 weeks. Some of that's going to be based on how confident the teams are that they've got this, that they can use the system and understand the data reports that they get and so forth. And to some, but we will be sharing this with you as we develop it. And Ken, do you want to add anything?
So basically, these are the folks that are helping with the training and teaching of the whole system then?
Well, I'm talking about the people who are using it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, Mr. Chair, that'll do me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Takano, Chairman Takano, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the most recent report from the OIG on training, it states, quote, "The OIG did not find evidence in the current governance structure that VHA, meaning the Veterans Health Administration, which houses all of the clinical and administrative staff who will rely on the new EHR system to perform their duties, that VHA had a definite role in participating in the decision-making or oversight activities related to the EHR modernization effort," end quote. So, Dr. Clancy, in your role as acting Deputy Secretary, would you agree with the OIG's statement? There's
Yes.
no evidence that they had a defined role.
Yes.
Thank you.
What I heard again and again was that OEHRM had supported travel training and so forth for a number of different councils, looking at different areas of clinical care, primary care, mental health, surgery, and so forth, and extensive training to plan on paper what these standardized workflows would look like. It's not clear to me that doing this 3 years prior to deployment, that there was renewal of all of that, or that VHA had an ongoing voice in decisions that were made with the contract.
So with your extensive experience and responsibility over the EHRM program and your participation in the strategic review, is this an acceptable structure going forward, meaning that VHA not having a defined role in the decision-making or the oversight activities related to HR modernization?
Absolutely not. And that's why I was very impressed, and I think all of you heard Dr. Matthews just a few minutes ago talking about what a readiness criteria checklist would look like. And we did not have a clearly defined functional champion then. That is a very key lesson that we learned from the Department of Defense and wasted no time in learning that.
Well, what exactly are your plans to provide VHA more of a role in the EHRM governance structure?
So we will look forward to giving you a sort of finalized version of this new governance and management structure, but in its essence, the program office, OINT, and VHA will work very closely and report to the Deputy Secretary in terms of how things are going to get done, and the Deputy Secretary will have a far more active role than some of my predecessors in terms of insisting on jointness and transparency across the different components.
Well, that's good to hear. I'll be looking forward to seeing
Great.
that plan. Mr. Case, it is apparent from your report that this governance structure has contributed to the issues that we're now seeing in the training. After seeing the results from the strategic review and the responses from VHA to your report, is there a sufficient plan in place to make real changes to improve training?
Congressman, we just don't know yet. We've seen their lessons learned, but there has to be more detail, which we've heard is going to be provided in terms of how they're going to set up the new governance structure, who does what, and the role of the Deputy Secretary, how the Deputy Secretary will implement his role. So at this point, we understand the aspirations, but we don't know the details on how it's going to occur.
Well, thank you. The OIG report on training highlighted that the facility director at Mann Grandstaff and the acting undersecretary for health notified OEHRM's executive director and chief medical officer that they felt that an operational readiness assessment was necessary months prior to the initial go-live. They also reported significant concerns to OEHRM leadership regarding disturbing feedback from staff on the insufficient training program. And despite these warnings, VHA met resistance from OEHRM leaders and were not included in the decision-making discussions. Dr. Clancy, as the acting deputy secretary, were you aware of the issues that VHA was having with getting through to OEHRM management?
I became aware of it, but that would have been some time after those
It was
concerns were
post-fact. It was
expressed.
post.
Yeah,
It was
yeah.
post. If the facility director was concerned about insufficient training for staff that poses a direct threat to patient safety, what was being done at VA since receiving this report from OIG to resolve this issue?
I think even ahead of the official report being published, the Secretary and I were both briefed about the report and in particular about the concerns about potentially altering data and so forth. So we were putting people on the ground and people that we thought could be most helpful to the teams in Spokane, and frankly checking in with them pretty often. The Secretary himself went out there in April, and others were in very frequent touch with the people in Spokane. Do you want to add to that? Okay. And so we weren't waiting for the final report to be published to act. Now our big challenge is how do we make this, how do we restore confidence and competence at Mann Grandstaff, and how do we develop a readiness checklist and a training plan going forward that can be a repeatable process and, incorporate what we learn, right? So the hope is, for example, when we finally get to a second deployment, that goes a lot more smoothly than Mann Grandstaff, but it probably won't be flawless. We will learn from that and continue to improve throughout.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is there going to be another round of question with this panel? There will be. Okay, and then I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Takano. At this point, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Clancy, the report also states VA will integrate all veteran transactions across health benefits and memorials into a single veteran online experience on va.gov. Does VA intend to develop a new patient portal, or will one of the existing two be integrated into va.gov? If so, which one?
Thank you for the question. Our Veteran Experience Office has been conducting what they would call a human-centered design sprint, which means they have been doing a pretty deep dive with at least 50 veteran users and have, from that experience, crystallized a lot of different themes. trying to figure out how do we get to a model that has the best of My Healthy Vet, that's the VA portal, and I'm sorry that I'm forgetting the name of the Cerner portal. Not so much in terms of brand name, right? Do you like our logo better than theirs? But in terms of functionality, which features do you like and so forth. And, you know, needless to say, these have been, I think, pretty impassioned conversations that they've had, but we think it's going to be worthwhile. We're now reviewing the contractual and legal steps going forward in terms of our contract, but we'll be sharing that with you. I think that we will end up with something like a hybrid model between the features of the Cerner product and what veterans really like and appreciate about My Healthy Vet, but we thought it was absolutely vital to get the veterans' voice into this.
And in the form of a question, you and I had talked in the past about an appointment being made going to the wrong location.
Yes.
Will there be steps or measures of firewalls to try and prevent that so that it is not up to human error?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. If you can get us any type of information that will solidify that answer, we'd greatly appreciate it. And then my next question would be, the strategic review noted that there were two main types of trouble tickets being entered: user experience issues, and the change request issues. What is the timeline for addressing those concerns?
We are addressing many of those concerns now. Changes are something that we are usually negotiating with the Department of Defense. It's not an extensive timeline to get this resolved, but we have to notify them because, again, we're trying to create this seamless experience for the service member who then becomes a veteran and so forth. So we don't want to have two unique customized systems. And we are working through patient safety issues right now.
And just as a follow-up, if you can please provide the committee with a summary of the findings and explanation of key issues identified, we'd greatly appreciate it.
From the strategic review?
Correct. Specifically talking about the timeline of addressing the concerns on the trouble tickets being entered and the experience issues and change requests.
Got it.
At this time, Mr. Rosendale, I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Finally, Dr. Matthews. You didn't think I was going to let you off this afternoon, did you?
Not at all.
The strategic review report says the contract did not capture all the work, particularly activities that the Office of Information Technology and Veterans Health Administration are funding. What work was excluded?
It's a very good question, sir. My understanding is that OEHRM did not necessarily take into account, actually very in line with the concept of the comprehensive checklist that I talked about, the additional functionality throughout VHA would need to be built. So an example, in the pharmacy module of Cerner, typically now with the multiple different versions of Vista, the formulary is controlled at the facility level. Now, with a single enterprise approach, we need to manage a national formulary. The pharmacy office, for instance, doesn't necessarily have a team or the resources to build a national formulary. Well, we have one, but it's at a committee level, but to manage it, it should take some staffing resources. Same thing at the revenue cycle standpoint, same thing with biomed devices. There's a couple of different areas where we see in VHA, we need to build some additional functionality. We also recognize that some of that functionality should remain at the VISN level, where instead currently under the legacy system, a lot of this more informatics sort of work is done at the facility. So where VHA actually has resources distributed could require some additional cost that we're seeing. We also want to make sure that from a productivity standpoint that we're supporting the facilities, that we're staffing appropriately in the clinical resource hubs, which are the VISN telehealth hubs, and that we're even maybe supporting the facilities and the VISN with some people in person. That's also some funding resources. So those sort of additional costs on the VHA side to keep operations moving while using the system, those are some additional costs for VHA. I personally couldn't speak to the OIT costs, but at least for VHA, that's what I'm looking at as the functional champion as far as additional resources I would need to make sure that this program is successful.
And have you created or made any determinations about how much this extra work is going to cost?
So we had some initial estimates for, I believe the funding was just for Spokane and Columbus. We had put together, I mean, because of course the deployment is stretching out over years, we were looking at it as far as funding requests per year. I did have a funding request in place for FY22 to the sum of just over 70 million, I believe, and that VHA has.
What was that again? I'm sorry.
About 70 million. Again, to distribute resources to Visions 20 and 10 to support program offices like biomed devices, revenue. That was a very early estimate, and so that's just what we're working off of currently. Obviously, that funding isn't necessarily as applicable, being that the deployment calendar is not yet necessarily finalized moving ahead.
So when you say $70 million, are you taking Columbus and Spokane and basically giving them their pro rata portion of that, and that's what you're calling the 70 million? When you say some of these programs are set up to cover the nation.
Exactly.
So is that 70 million for the whole nation, or is that 70 million just for the Spokane?
A combination of the above. So some of that would stay in different respective program offices at central office. Some of that is designated for the Visions. Some of that is designated for additional support staff at the facility level. So it's actually all three levels.
Okay. That's all that I have right now, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. At this time, we'd like to recognize Chairman Takano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Ravan. Dr. Clancy, I just want to remind you that the VA told the committee in advance of this hearing that you would be able to answer for OEHRM, who is not present today. So my question is, can you tell me about what is OHRM's excuse for not taking the issues from the facility director and the acting secretary for health into account? And I'm referring back to the earlier statement I read about the OIG report highlighting that the facility director at Manned Grant Staff and the acting secretary for health notified the executive director and chief medical officer they felt that operational readiness assessment was necessary months prior to initial go live. So I just want to remind, can you tell me, speak to that?
From my conversations with the leadership of OEHRM, I think they believed that it was important not to keep delaying the initial deployment, that we would learn a great deal, and they didn't expect it to go well, and that is not an unreasonable expectation, right? Because almost every private sector system we spoke with told us that the initial deployment is always really challenging, really challenging. Painful was the other word that was used, and I would have to surmise that they believed that we should get on with it and learn more, because this is how we actually deploy systems like this on the ground. I don't think they expected the reaction they got either from the people in Spokane or, frankly, the people in senior leadership positions in the department.
All right, well, thank you. For Mr. Case, in your report, you stated that in June 2021, the acting deputy secretary informed your office that comments received from OHRM staff and the executive director in response to your report on training deficiencies in May 2021 did not represent the views of the acting deputy secretary or the office of the undersecretary for health, and submitted a revised response. Now, I want to ask you, is this common in your experience to have this type of conflict within VA when submitting a response to your reports?
It is uncommon, extremely uncommon, and the document we received from OEHRM early, responding to our report, was out of the ordinary enough that the IG himself contacted the acting deputy secretary to find out if this was the comments that VA wanted to provide. And so it is uncommon, and we took action, and the acting deputy secretary responded.
Dr. Clancy, thank you for that. Dr. Clancy, can you comment or elaborate on the issues you had with the executive director's response to the OIG report?
So in my oral statement, I reflected on an organizational silo. I think the program office thought that they had full responsibility for the deployment, and the buck stops here. We're running this major contract and so on and so forth. And I don't know if it was genuine misinterpretation, but they responded to questions and recommendations made to others more senior than they, as if the recommendations were made to the OEHRM, and which was not appropriate. So I appreciated the heads up from the Inspector General, and we worked through that.
Well, thank you. It is also stated that you concurred with all of the IG's recommendations. Was that not the case in the executive director's response?
I thought the initial response from the executive director more or less said, we've got this, and we'll follow up in a year. I didn't think they were serious responses.
Okay. Mr. Case, in your opinion, is this a symptom of a broken management system in the EHRM program?
I think it is a symptom of that. I think Dr. Clancy described it well. There was a siloed system, and OEHRM thought that they had the complete responsibilities here and moved forward with those in this response.
Mr. Chairman, I just have one more question, might I? Please. Thank you. Mr. Case, what is your confidence level that the strategic review is going to address these management issues?
It has to address this management issues, and I have confidence that they will attempt to address them and provide more detailed plans, because everyone wants this program to succeed, and for it to succeed, it's going to have a governance structure that makes it work and brings it forward effectively.
All right, well, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. With that being said, I'd like to thank you for your patience and your participation. And I thank you for what you do for our veterans every single day, and for the taxpayers and your commitment and dedication to quality health care and quality service. We will continue going forward. We appreciate you getting that information to the committee. Dr. Clancy, I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for your message to make sure and making and identifying that those who have not been vaccinated, who are veterans, to reiterate that we're encouraging all of those to take care of themselves and their families. With that, I'd like to, with there being no other further questions, the first panel is excused. Thank you for your participation today. We will take a 5-minute recess during the transition.
Are the platform hosts ready to begin?
Yes.
Chairman Mervan, are you ready to resume?
Yes.
Please provide a 5-second countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. At this time, I bring the meeting back to order. On our second panel, we have with us Mr. Brian Sondauger, the General Manager of Cerner Government Services. Mr. Sondauger is accompanied by Mr. Avi Vaswani, Vice President of Cerner Government Services. Mr. Sondauger, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Mervan, Ranking Member Rosendale, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Brian Sondauger, Senior Vice President and General Manager of Cerner Government Services. I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing and for your continued support of VA's Electronic Health Record Modernization Program. Together, we have achieved historic milestones in the decades-long journey to provide service members and veterans a lifetime of seamless care. They have waited far too long, and we owe it to them to get this right. With over 20 years supporting Cerner clients around the world, and as a former Chief Information Officer for a health system, I can attest that VA is at an important juncture in the program and realizing their vision of seamless care. Based on my experience in the commercial industry, and as highlighted by Mr. Probst's testimony last week, many implementations stall after their initial deployment due to a lack of clear vision, requirements, governance, leadership, and timely decisions. Continued success requires, among other things, transparency and an unwavering dedication to do what's right for veterans and VA providers. Success starts at the top, from establishing clear governance process and expectations that allow an organization to remain agile in identifying and resolving issues. We have not done a good enough job articulating to VA end users why this transformation is so important for the veterans, the benefits it will achieve for the enterprise, and we will partner with VA to change this. I commend the Secretary for his leadership, his focus on governance, and desire for a data-driven approach to this program. We have a capability built into our solution that provides access to thousands of data points and hundreds of KPIs or key performance indicators for VA to choose from, substantially increasing the number of KPIs over their current VISTA systems. I've outlined several in my written testimony, but I wanted to highlight one in particular surrounding alert notifications to providers. Nearly 300 opioid prescriptions have been modified based on Cerner EHR alerts, resulting in alternative treatments for those at higher risk of substance use disorders. Because VA and DoD are using a single common system, the data surrounding opioid use is actionable to providers in both departments, improving patient safety. While we share VA's promise to deliver safe, effective, and timely care as noted in the strategic review, no incidents of significant patient harm related to the deployment occurred. Since go-live, we have implemented nearly 800 changes, including significant progress and improvements to training, simplifying workflow designs and alerts, and reducing the time providers are spending in the system. Applying these lessons learned and implementing change requests is exactly why we have an initial operating capability deployment. Once this system went live, opportunities to simplify workflows that were over-engineered and enhancements to the training methodology became apparent. Though we have made meaningful progress, I fully acknowledge there are still several complex challenges we need to solve for, including revenue cycle, the patient portal, and continued advancement in end-user adoption. Cerner takes our responsibility to veterans, to taxpayers, and to Congress to solve these challenges seriously, and we remain committed to working with the VA on a path forward outlined in their strategic review findings. While the road ahead may be difficult, we must remember why we are given this opportunity. This isn't about Cerner. This is about veterans, service members, and their families for generations to come, whose lives will be made better and easier because we did what it took now to get this right. With each site we deploy to, we will collect additional lessons learned, and the VA will be able to make more informed decisions on design and workflow standardization to benefit the enterprise. That is why collaboration across VA stakeholder groups will be essential going forward. I want to thank the members of this subcommittee and your staff for your candor and openness with sharing concerns you hear from veterans and end users. Cerner is honored to partner with Congress and the VA as we continue this important mission. With your ongoing support, we will continue to achieve our shared goal. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sondauger. At this time, I'd recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. The IG report on training indicates that Cerner provided substandard training to super users and end users at manned grant staff. What is Cerner's role in redesigning the training program for EHRM? What do you need from VA to improve the training?
Thank you, sir, for the question. We look forward to partnering with the VA to improve the training through a number of ways. As you heard in the previous panel, one of the ways is to make sure that there's a holistic end-to-end workflow discussion with the end users. Due to the COVID and the pandemic, along with a number of other challenges, the typical best practice training was not able to be deployed, and that is something we look to remedy going forward. One of the things that's common in the commercial space is that the end users and the super users will participate all the way from design through the testing and into the training. And during that testing component of it, they see that end-to-end workflow because you're testing the system throughout. Given the pandemic and the impacts to the end users, testing was really focused from a technical perspective and really was not able to employ to the end users. So we're really looking forward to, as the previous panel shared, making sure that we have environments available for the end users to test the full workflow end-to-end. We've also partnered with the VA to make sure that training is provided outside of the normal workflow for an individual. For instance, pharmacists often get questions from providers on how to properly place a prescription order. And so teaching them, even though that's a different module within the system or a different screen view of it, how the physician workflow works, helps them operate as a team. And so we've already implemented those changes and we'll continue those going forward.
I asked this of the VA, and I want to get an answer from you. Is the training environment Cerner is using an exact replica of the production system with fake data?
Sir, it will be going forward. Our normal standard practice is to take a copy of the production domain and move that into the training environment, eliminate all of the real patient data in there, and then use that environment going forward. And that is one of the challenges of initial operating capability site is that you don't have that copy of a production domain because there's nothing live yet. So the initial training domain was really a copy of the DoD domain with the de-identified or no patient data in there. And I think the differences between the DoD and the VA workflow in the early days contributed to some of those training challenges.
In your testimony, you had mentioned that Mark Posps, during his testimony last week before the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, many electronic health record EHR implementations stall after initial deployment due to lack of governance, clarity, leadership, and making timely decisions. Can you give me an example of timely decisions that weren't made?
Yes, sir. When we looked at the initial deployment at Man Grandstaff, there were decisions around the design of the system at the national workshop level that were impacted by the pandemic. And some of those decisions came in very late or had to be made at a late date. That then does impact our ability to build the training system to reflect those decisions, and then ultimately making sure that the training is in line with what the end user expectation is at the day of go live.
I want to go back to the subject of patient safety. In April, Dr. Krupa mentioned 247 patient safety incidents or issues at Man Grandstaff. I'm sure you agree that the safety of our nation's veterans is our paramount concern. Have you been made aware of the safety issues identified by Dr. Krupa, as well as the ones cited in the strategic review?
Yes, sir. We agree wholeheartedly that patient safety is absolutely the most important thing. That is why we do the work that we do within our company. Healthcare transformation is critical, and patient safety is at the core of that. And that's really what we focus on, is improving patient safety. I do want to comment, sir, that we take patient safety so seriously that if a patient safety is reported by any of our clients, we immediately respond to that with associates on what we call a bridge line, which is a conference call line, and we stay on that line until it is either resolved or until the client lets us know that has no longer been a patient safety issue or that they've qualified against that. So one of the challenges we've had is really making sure that we follow the protocol around patient safety, and we look forward with the VA in working through that to make sure that we're engaged in any of those patient safety concerns.
Okay. And, well, I've got 14 seconds. So with that, I will recognize Congressman Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to stay right on this patient safety issue, Mr. Sondager, because that is a very big concern. Did Cerner play any role in preparing the patient safety incident report with the VA?
No, sir.
None whatsoever.
We did provide data to the VA upon request on any of the incidents or any of the issues that come up.
So you did play a role in it then?
Not in the actual report itself, sir, no.
You provided all the data for the report?
We provide it, anytime we're queried on data, we provide data on that, but we don't always know why we're queried for that data, sir.
Okay, so let me rephrase this. So all of the data that was provided for the report that the VA produced was provided by Cerner?
No, sir, I don't believe that's the case. We know we have responded to data calls from the VA on any specific incidents, configurations, or anything within the system, but the VA, I believe, does all of their own patient safety investigations.
Okay. What do you attribute the dramatic increase in patient safety incidents to?
I would have to defer to the VA on that, sir.
Is the Man Grandstaff Medical Center safe?
As a non-clinical provider, sir, as a non-clinician, I'd have to defer to the VA on that. We do take the patient safety concerns very seriously. And, to our knowledge, as stated in the previous testimony, there's been no issues of patient harm in that. And as I stated in my testimony as well, one of the important things in deploying a modern electronic health record is it actually helps you increase patient safety by having the necessary alerts and rules in place to make sure that prescriptions or other things aren't inappropriately provided. So I think that our systems actually improve patient safety over the long haul.
So I understand that that's what the intent, and if it's functioning properly, that is the whole purpose, and that's why we're making this major investment. But if we don't have it functioning properly, then it can actually raise jeopardy. And it's my understanding, and you can certainly correct the record, but that we don't have any record of significant patient harm.
That's correct, sir. And I have no.
So what would your definition of significant patient harm or insignificant patient harm be?
We defer to our clients on what patient harm is. And sir, from our knowledge, there's no functionality that we've been asked to change that impacts patient safety.
Do you believe that the Cerner system at Man Grandstaff is fully functional?
Sir, yes, the system at Man Grandstaff has met all the requirements that we've been asked to meet, and that's where we continue to partner with the VA on any new requirements that they need to meet their needs.
So you're telling me today that you feel that the system in Man Grandstaff is fully functional?
Per my testimony, sir, there are some areas in Man Grandstaff, but it's not specifically Man Grandstaff in the revenue cycle space and the patient portal that we are still working with the VA on.
So, yes or no? Fully functional?
Then no, sir, outside of those areas, but those aren't in Man Grandstaff themselves. The revenue cycle is in Las Vegas, sir.
Excuse me?
The revenue cycle system is used in Las Vegas. That is where the CPAC is, where they do their billing out of Las Vegas, sir.
Okay. How does your definition of fully functional differ from the VA's definition?
Our definition is based on the defined requirements that they give us, sir.
What needs to happen to make the system fully functional as per VA's definition?
We need to complete the revenue cycle enhancements that they have requested, and we are waiting their decision on patient portal and any additional requirements that they would like us to implement, and then based on any additional requirements, we'll make those changes, sir.
Do you agree with the VA's exit criteria for Man Grandstaff?
We have not been provided exit criteria for Man Grandstaff, sir.
How many Cerner employees are at Man Grandstaff right now?
At this moment, I'd have to get back with you on that, sir, but we have 7 employees that will be there forever, or as long as we're a partner with the VA, and Congress. That is a part of our best practice to make sure that we have associates that stay behind and are there to support the facilities. And we do make sure that those associates are really ingrained in the community. The gentleman that leads that unit is a veteran and uses Man Grandstaff as his facility. And so I think that's really important and a part of our strategy, making sure that we really have our long-term sustainment team embedded with the VA.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. At this time, I'd like to recognize Chairman Takano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, the OIG's report revealed that Cerner's training staff's lack of clinical knowledge was an impediment to training VA staff, and specifically a facility leader stated that it was going to be on VA staff ultimately to figure it out. So Mr. Sondager, do you feel that the trainers that you provided to the VA under this contract are sufficient to provide the level of expertise necessary to train VA staff on your system and the new workflows?
Thank you, sir, for the question. We always take great pride in not just providing trainers, but also a combination of clinical trainers, so that have physicians and nurses in addition to pharmacists and people with those backgrounds, in addition to the general trainers. In this specific instance with the deployment, as said in the previous panel, unfortunately, due to COVID, some of those trainers were impacted by COVID, actually did get COVID or were exposed to COVID and were removed from the training. In addition to that, we have, based on feedback, increased the number of clinical trainers that we have. One of the things that I would like to point out, sir, is that a great partnership with our clients in training is dependent on them also having the super users with us to be able to know those current workflows and help translate that. And so it is the Cerner trainers with the client and the users that really make for the most ideal training. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, some of that was impacted, but we look forward to correcting that going forward.
Well, are the requirements being provided to you on the current IQ sufficient to ensure that the work you are performing will be successful?
Yes, sir. The current IDIQ has, let me rephrase, there are some great requirements in the current IDIQ. I do think that there's always an opportunity to enhance those requirements. And as we've worked with the VA, for example, on KPIs or key performance indicators, I think there's opportunity to continue to improve on those and bring better visibility to what are the best performance indicators for success.
So the requirements are sufficient for you to create, to ensure that the work you're performing will be successful?
The general requirements are helpful, but I think additional requirements would be warranted, sir.
All right, well, I'm sort of hearing that, that they haven't been or not. Is there sufficient communication between the OHRM, the program, and contract staff, and Cerner to ensure that these problems are not repeated in the future?
Yes, sir. We're in very close contact with OEHRM. The teams meet with them frequently. And if it's all right, I would like to have Avi speak to that. As the program leader, he meets with OEHRM and the VA very frequently on that. So, Avi, would you mind commenting?
Well, Mr. Sondergaard, I want to ask you about Cerner's involvement in the production of the strategic review. To what extent were you all involved in the production of the strategic review?
We answered data calls as required from OEHRM in support of the strategic review, but that was the extent of our involvement, sir.
Are you aware of any other contractors that participated in the creation of the strategic review?
I am aware, or I was informed, that I believe Deloitte was utilized for some activities at Man-Grand staff, but that's my extent of knowledge in terms of other contractors' involvement.
What else would you have liked to? What else would you like to see in the strategic review results that will help you provide a better product to VA?
I think the strategic review did a great job in highlighting the need for governance, as you all have discussed. I think that's an important thing. Communication, transparency. I think definition of the key performance indicators, what are the metrics and the data that we're going to measure success by, I think is really important. And I do applaud the Secretary and his team for taking this seriously and making sure that we make those necessary improvements collectively as a team. I do believe that it is also very important, as the previous panel stated, to really focus on change leadership. Leadership and change of this magnitude requires a lot of leadership, and so I think that's an important factor as well, sir.
Well, the IG report also stated that VA, quote, withheld some training and evaluation data requested by the OIG and altered other data prior to sending it to the OIG. Have you received all of the information that you requested from VA, Mr.?
No, sir.
That's actually wrong. I'm sorry, sir. That was meant for a different. I withdraw the question, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman. At this time, I'd like to recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. As we heard earlier in its strategic review, VA has indicated that it will be moving to an enterprise-wide infrastructure upgrade process. Mr. Sondauger, what does that mean to you, and what is your understanding of that?
So my understanding, sir, is that the VA wishes to do what we call current state reviews at a national level and take a subset of the current state reviews to allow them to have an understanding of the entire lay of the land, if you will, across the country and all their facilities. And we'd be happy to support them in those efforts.
How does that change Cerner's approach and methodology?
I don't think it would change it necessarily dramatically. It would just chunk it a little bit differently. So instead of doing a current state review in its entirety site by site, we'd be doing a subset across the entirety of the country of that current state review. And then as they make selections on where we would deploy, we'd come back to refresh that and then execute. That's my understanding of the direction.
So I was going to follow up on something. Earlier it was the term buttonology in the training that really focused on the functionality but not the holistic view of what was going on in the system. What has Cerner, or what will Cerner change in its training to make sure that that term is erased and that training system is erased?
Thank you, sir. Good question. And yes, don't like that terminology, and we want to get that fixed. And so one of the things that we'll do differently is starting all the way at the beginning with trying to help explain the entirety of the workflow and the why we're doing this. That's why my testimony, I think that's really important for us to get right. It's not just about the end user and their individual change, but the holistic change across the enterprise to give that seamless care for veterans regardless of where they get care across the country or really around the world. And when we look at the way we deploy that training, initially doing just an orientation to the system, which was the intent, I think that got us in a bad situation with the users. I think starting out with the why at the first, that's the most important thing. And then it is necessary to do some orientation towards the system, but I think framing that appropriately is important. And we look forward to partnering with the VA to use the right terminology that will land well with their end users, sir.
And you had mentioned your experience in the private sector and other major rollouts. My question would be, are there any infrastructure-related reasons that would cause an initial waves of deployment to be postponed?
I'm not aware of any infrastructure issues that would cause initial waves to be postponed. I'd have to get back to you on that if there was any additional details. But I would like to comment, sir, on my commercial experience. One of the things that's hugely beneficial about training and about future sites is when you have users from the previous site that went live and they move forward to the next site and share their experiences. A VA person speaking to a VA person about that change is very helpful. We saw that with the DoD, and we've seen that help them accelerate their deployments in the second half of their programs, and we think that that'll be very helpful for the VA in their next sites as well, sir.
Can you give me examples of, in 2017, the deployment of the DoD? What was learned there that now, in retrospect, after the first rollout, should have been implemented based on that experience?
I think one of the things that was learned there was around the definition of patient safety and making sure that that is crisp within the VA, just like the DoD had that same challenge. And I think with the deployment at Man Grandstaff, I think there was, with everything going on in COVID and everything else, I think there was a lack of focus on that prior to the deployment, and I think that's a lesson that we should have learned and kept, focus on as we went live at Man Grandstaff and helped the VA with that.
Okay, thank you very much. At that time, I'd like to recognize Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sandiger, you said that the 7 employees that you have at Man Grandstaff are going to stay there forever?
Through the duration of our contract, yes, sir. The intent with the contract is to have within each one of the VISNs to have a leave-behind support staff that will support the VA over the long haul until the VA decides to take that over. But the purpose for that is there'll always be upgrades to our system as new capabilities come on. Within healthcare, there's new innovation all of the time. And so we want to make sure that there's always teams there to address that, to be able to make sure that they're within the region to help the VA systems with their continued upgrades and continued improvements.
So I'm taking that these are the main technology folks or whatever that you have there on the site. Roughly, how many other people do you think you have there?
So on any given day, we could have dozens of additional people there, and depending on the event, if there's an upgrade, we would fly in more of those. But on Go Live, we had hundreds of people available.
And when do you expect the balance of these folks to leave?
That's why the exit criteria for Man Grandstaff is important for the VA so that we're able to do that. Today, we fly in and out as needed to support the VA as they go through their strategic review or advancements or Tiger teams or other efforts.
When you entered into the contract, let me ask you this. How long had you anticipated that they were going to be there?
90 days, sir.
Okay, and so how long have they been there now?
9 months.
9 months.
Give or take.
A little bit over.
Yep.
Okay.
And just one comment, sir, if I may, over the duration, of our clients, even if it's the sustainment team, those 7 people are supposed to be there, they can always call in for help if they need additional help to come in.
Okay, so why was the original bid or quote that you presented so flawed or so low?
In terms of the 90 days, sir?
In terms of the entire package?
I don't know that it was and the best information we had on the requirements of the VA at the time is what we utilized to make our bid or our quote. As requirements changed, then that's the only thing that we've changed in terms of our requirements.
So as the expert in this arena, though, as demonstrated by the sheer fact that you were a sole source bidder, shouldn't Cerner have recognized or anticipated these additional problems?
In terms of the additional problems, in terms of how long it's taken us to exit man grand staff from a project team perspective. Yeah, the initial operating side always is more challenging. We did anticipate, some of that, and that's why the initial operating site deployment had that in there. Nobody could have anticipated the pandemic or the impacts to the schedule that's happened.
But this was all started, and the rollout was supposed to begin long before we started having problems with the pandemic.
Yes, sir. The rollout, the initial
And so
site
again,
rollout
as
was
the sole
delayed due to
source,
the
as a
pandemic.
sole source vendor, okay, supposed to be the expert in the industry, don't you believe that Cerner should have recognized or anticipated some of these difficulties in this rollout?
Yes, sir. We did anticipate a lot of difficulties. I mean, we do anticipate the initial operating site would have those challenges. As I said in my testimony, that's the purpose of an IOC, is to make sure that we learn those lessons and adjust to those workflows. We also anticipated that we would have access to VA staff through the national workshops and those design sessions, the last of which were impacted by the pandemic. And so, yes, sir, we anticipate a lot of that, but we did
The
not
problem is, though, unfortunately, taxpayers are being forced to train Cerner, as far as what we see at this end, as well as VA staff at man grand staff, because they're being used as a lab to figure this whole system out and process with which you're trying to get your people to understand the system that you're selling and get the man grand staff employees to be able to implement it. So you're trying to figure out how to train them better, and we're paying for it. And we're paying for it. Something that you anticipated was going to be 90 days, it was 9 months, and we still have them. And at the end of the day, the taxpayers are still responsible for that.
Well, sir, just to clarify, many of the costs that have been borne by us through no-cost extensions. To extend some of those things like the advancements that has been borne by our cost under our fixed fee contract. And secondly, sir, I do want to point out that from a training perspective, a lot of our commercial best practices for training that we would have anticipated to deploy, as I stated earlier, we're not able to deploy because as we had our trainers available to do that, some of that had to be moved to a virtual environment, or our trainers and our end user support associates had to leave the site due to the COVID impacts.
Mr. Chair, I see my time is up. I would yield back. Thank you. Appreciate that. Mr. Sandiger, do you believe that there needs to be an organizational change in the VA in order to resolve some of these issues identified at man grand staff?
Sir, I think that governance and communication across an organization as large as the VA is critical, and that's really important, and I applaud the Secretary's work in moving forward with that governance. I think that's really important, as highlighted by the first panel.
So what would you like to specifically see changed?
I'd like to see, better requirements around what are the metrics that the success metrics that both VHA and the VA broadly would like to see as a result of the implementations, how they measure productivity and how they would like to utilize those KPIs to measure success.
And do you believe that there needs to be similar organizational changes at Cerner to help address some of this?
Yes, sir, and we've made a lot of those organizational changes. We've brought in additional expertise in training and change management specific to the VA with those expertise. I've also brought in senior leaders on my team, like Avi and others, that have spent a long time working with the VA to have that expertise and make sure we understand the nuances of the VA. And those are changes we'll continue to make in order to support the VA and Congress appropriately.
Thank you. That's it, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
With that, I have no further questions. I would like to thank the panel, and I'm going to start my closing statement. I want to extend my welcoming to the new Deputy Secretary, Mr. Donald Remy, who was sworn in this week and is taking over management of the EHRM program. closing. You know, we try to be a little bit more efficient. Here, I'll do it. I got it. So at this time, obviously, excuse me for that flaw. First in-person hearing, I want to share with you. We'll get you a strategic review of what just happened within the next couple of weeks. But obviously, as what I think the intentions are to make sure that Cerner works in conjunction with the VA, VHA, and we focus on finding the results. Your seriousness when it comes to patient outcomes and patient safety is a vital part of this entire program, and making sure that we do it efficiently and at a time that we are prepared for it. And as a steward of the taxpayer dollars, we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to stay within budget and to do it right for our veterans. That being said, I thank you very much, and I'm going to ask Mr. Rosendale if you have any closing statements.
I just would say that I appreciate everybody coming in, sharing information. I may be the cynic on this panel, but I've got major concerns about the amount of money that continues to flow out of Washington, D.C. to Cerner without having a fully functional facility in Grandstaff, and continue to hear that we're going to be introducing it to other areas. I'm not convinced yet. I'm not a believer, folks. We've got major problems up there. We've got billions of dollars that have been sent out, and you haven't convinced me yet. Sorry.
And that being said, all members will have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials. This hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.